place. So that will be really exciting for me to hear. Okay. Yeah, after those words, maybe, yeah, I will just share some of my reflections on the rural as I perceive it in Western Europe, where I am based. Okay, try to see if I can move. Yeah. So as I tried to show on the slide, and what also Oyok already alluded to, today, often it is commonplace to say that we are in the midst of a so-called urban age, like in an age in which the urban condition is a global phenomenon. So the cultural discourse of Western Europe, which I'm exposed to, connects the urban to ideas of the future and the rural to ideas of the past, exactly as Oyok just said. Rural, and here I quote, is often depicted as a passive recipient of modernity. So for instance, while there are many researchers busy imagining good cities, there are way fewer who imagine good countrysides. In the same way, another example, research on transitions towards environmentally sound futures is mostly done in cities. Cities are understood as places where innovative practices proliferate and from where a certain transformation is supposed to start. And similarly, in another field of study, as another example, the concept of a so-called planetary urbanization describes the urban as dominating the global countryside. So in this concept, urbanization is said to encompass the whole world. And the distinction between urban and rural is thereby assumed to have dissolved by replacing the countryside through an urbanity that governs, that rules over every place in this world. And as Oyok already introduced, rural futurism as a lens rejects all of this. It rejects the mainstream idea of the countryside as represented in Europe and the West more broadly. Rural futurism as a term is inspired by a quote, which I'm showing here on the slide, by Nicholas Mark, in which he talks about a British writer who is called John Berger. And this writer had, in the 1970s, moved to a French mountain village. And the experiences of living there, he transformed them into a book in which he describes the rapid transformation of peasant life in Europe, amongst others, due to industrialization, capitalist urbanization. And what does Mark write about Berger? He writes that to Berger, the countryside was a space of opportunity, more free and less defined than overly controlled and museumized in the cities. One must think of Berger not as a modernity-adverse ruralist, but as a rural futurist. And rural futurism, beyond the term, borrowing it from Nicholas Mark, it builds on different kinds of scholarship. And I'm just saying a few words about that. So rural futurism builds, amongst others, on feminist scholarship and post-colonial scholarship. And this scholarship is particularly interesting because it refuses totalizing theories, such as theories of a planetary urbanization or a theory of a planetary capitalism. So while, of course, those scholars acknowledge the dominance of capitalism and the ongoing process of urbanization worldwide, feminist and post-colonial scholars point out how in all of those systems, there is difference, and there are disruptions, and there's resistance. And if we start to acknowledge them, if we start to nurture them and learn from them, we can regain hope on our way towards creating better futures. So while capitalist logics reign the global economy, non-capitalist practices have persisted in an abundance of places worldwide. The values of care, solidarity, justice, trust, friendship, and family have continued to override capitalist principles in millions of communities and their local economies. In the very same way, while capitalist urbanization is widespread, it has certainly not erased the multitude of ruralities, rural places, rural practices that exist across space. All of these rural places bring their own contributions to the making of the future. And many of these places, by defying the principles of capitalist urbanization, have valuable lessons to share for making better environmentally and socially just futures. They simply need to be seen rather than written out of history. And after all, there is great political potential in the margin and in the periphery, as many famous scholars, such as the scholar Ruth Wilson Gilmore, or here, as you see on the right, Bell Hooks, have explicated. So Bell Hooks, for instance, describes, and I quote her here, the margin as a space of radical openness, which, while it simultaneously can be a site of repression, is all the same a site of resistance. And I thought to give some more examples here. The rural has been observed to be a resource for radical left politics. So radical movements have understood the countryside as a source of practices that can be used to address current and future problems. These initiatives resist capitalist ideas of what the countryside should be, such as ideas that the countryside is a mere place for monocultural food production, or the countryside as a place for industrial zones, or for mere holiday resorts. Instead, they practice local empowerment, self-sufficiency, and environmental sustainability. Researchers have taken inspiration in rural communities when investigating ways to overcome the market-centric and individualist approach to life in the West, studying, next to urban examples, rural community or solidarity economies, rural collective living projects, food sovereignty movement, or the concept of the good life is promoted by indigenous movements of the Latin American Andes. Many have taken inspiration from the rural indigenous communities of the Zapatista movement in Mexico, who you see on the right here. And then in France, where I did my fieldwork for this presentation, for the paper that I'm presenting, radical left movements have frequently been inspired by or set in the countryside. So in the French collective imagination, resistance against a military camp, also in the 1970s, kind of marked a rupture in popular understandings of the spaces of left politics. Because for several years there, local peasants and together with urban squatters occupied the land that was designated for the military camp as part actually of a broader movement against authoritarian state power and globalization. The region thereby became a role model for rural resistance and rural resistance movements in France particularly. And a similar kind of fame has been reached more recently by an occupation of land that was designated for an airport project. And there, as the strategy of resistance was in fact to live on the designated land for that airport project, the occupation slowly transformed into a collective experiment of alternative living in the countryside. So to sum up, rural futurism is a lens that releases the countryside from its detention in a past, faraway world and guides attention to the many rural performances, rural initiatives, rural places that contribute to the making of the future. It starts from the idea that in order to work towards more hopeful futures, we have to build on and empower the existing initiatives that are already constructing them, and many of them are located also in the countryside. And the term rural futurism is thereby also chosen in contrast to another term that is often used when referring to alternative initiatives in the countryside. Often the term that is used is rural utopia. But in fact, the term rural utopia is dangerously close to a mainstream imagination of the rural as a faraway place, a place that is in the past. Because utopia, when we look at the actual term as it was introduced, while it actually means a good place, it also means no place. So it's kind of an imagination of an alternative world, but one that's not real. So speaking of rural utopias would merely reinforce the idea that rural places are not really part of the course of history, are not really making any change. So talking of a radical initiative in the countryside as a utopia means questioning this initiative's ability to be an agent in the creation of alternative futures, in the transformation of our society towards a better version of itself. Rural futurism, in contrast, emphasizes the agency of the rural in the continuous, ongoing making of the future. And in fact, it's thereby inspired by Afrofuturism. So while Afrofuturism was originally coined as a form of speculative fiction, the interesting thing about Afrofuturism is that it actively fights against futures, and here I quote Kilgore, in which Blacks play minor roles or disappear entirely. And Afrofuturism reappropriates anticipations of the global and African future from the white technocratic elite. So the focus there lies on multiplying futures and realities to counter the idea of a singular Eurocentric time. This inspires to think of futures as multiple, as diverse, as co-produced by many different people. It inspires conceiving of rural futurism not as a project for constructing one perfect blueprint world, but rather it pushes us to perceive all different kinds of construction of the future as connected, as shaping each other, as doing all of this together. So an entanglement, a connection between the past and the future and the present, a connection between the urban and the rural and everything in between, a constant exchange between all of this. Yeah, and now in the remaining time, and I don't want to keep you too long because I see we're already rather late, but in the remaining time, I would really like to just present a bit about the case study that I have worked with, which is, as I said, already based in France. And the case is called the Ferme de la Motte, which is a small rural collective in central France. And the initiative perceives itself as a space of experimentation for different futures in the countryside. And the project of the initiative is open-ended. So they do not really aim for one predefined vision for the future, but rather the future for them cannot be put into just one single vision, but it is rather a slow, step-by-step coming together of different parts. But still, for the sake of clarity, I thought to give 3 ways in which I perceived that this initiative was trying to create alternative futures. So the first is that the initiative tries to overcome certain elements of capitalism. In their case, that means that in order to what they call revitalizing social life, the inhabitants transformed the land that they are on into a commons. And this collective ownership of the land is to be for them the seed for a rural self-governed economy that assures local social protection. And then second, the collective aims to find new ways in which humans and non-humans, so humans and plants and animals, can live alongside each other. They say about themselves that, and here I quote again, they imagine a politics, an economy, a culture that is common to humans and non-humans alike. So this they do, for instance, in the way in which they work with horses, in the way in which they use horses in their agriculture, and in the way in which they try to create and support biodiversity and ecological sustainability in their place. And then lastly, third, the collective works towards a community that lives in stronger connection to their territories and in bigger autonomy from external support systems. So these are 3 ways which I wanted to mention first, but of course, the question that I had when I did research with this community was asking, how does the initiative actually engage with its setting in the countryside? How does it use, or how is it related to typical rural ideas, practices, values? What does it mean for the initiative to be in the countryside? How does it transform or change the countryside? And I found first that the initiative in some way rediscovers stereotypically rural practices and simply recodes them, gives them a new meaning and says, well, these practices are futuristic. And then second, the other thing which I observed was that the initiative also transforms the countryside by by adding certain things, by enacting a kind of countryside that is maybe different to how it is usually conceived within France, within Western Europe. So the members of the collective bring new ideas, practices, and values to the rural place, and thereby transform the countryside away from how it is conventionally imagined. Yeah, I will quickly illustrate this. So one key technique for the futuristic practice at the initiative is the transformation of the rural towards a certain kind of rural diversity. So this means that the initiative is constructed in a way in which it does not have one single identity, but brings together different visions and identities. So in this way, it leaves an openness for the rural to become differently. The collective invites a variety of visions and projects to come together, rather than expecting its members to bow to one unified project. The collective comprises many different, often only loosely connected activities. And the initiative is thus not a bounded project with one singular objective, but actually, and I thought that was very interesting when I asked during my research day what the objective of the project was. One of the members responded to me saying, well, and I quote, "It is very modern to assume that there is one common vision or objective." And in that case, using modern really as a negative term, because there is something wrong with this assumption that there should only be one goal. And this does not mean that the people living together do not share affinities, but the collective allows for diversity and inconsistencies. And they understand this as a key for producing a resilient community. They say, yeah, because we have several activities, if problems arise in one activity, this does not affect the others. And then at the same time, the initiative also transforms the countryside to include a certain kind of connectivity, connection on a horizontal level. What do I mean with that? Because the countryside is often depicted as remote, as disconnected from processes that, well, make the future in some sense, the initiative actively tries to bring the world into the countryside and the countryside into the world. So they reach outwards by entertaining many connections to a wider network of initiatives, including researcher networks, artist networks, farming and agricultural networks. And at the same time, inviting inwards, the initiative was building a house when I was visiting to host guests from all of those networks. So thereby the initiative actively tries to be shaped by all those networks, but also actively shape those networks back, to actively have an impact, be part of the politics and developments elsewhere. So thereby the initiative changes the meaning of the countryside, from the countryside being remote and disconnected, and homogeneous, lacking diversity, by actively bringing in activities and ideas that produce diversity, then that produce connectivity. But this is only half of the story. At the same time, the members of the initiative, of the collective, rediscover the countryside as already being diverse, as already being connected. So what does that mean? This means, for instance, that the initiative emphasizes the many ways in which the countryside for them offers a certain diversity that more urban settings and big cities tend to lack or offer less, in their opinion. So the members of the initiative identify the countryside as for them motivating more activities that can be carried out by different people. So whereas in cities and their environment where some of them used to live as well, and what they experienced there was that many activities were done by professionals, whereas then in the countryside, in their smaller community, they had to learn to do those things themselves. They had to improvise, and that gave them, of course, a strong sense of autonomy. And then another kind of diversity that the members of the collective identify is the diversity of animals, of plants, and other non-humans that are present in the countryside. And I found it extremely interesting. They call the countryside, I quote, a multi-species town. So a place where the agency of animals, of plants, and other environmental forces is more obvious than in cities. And this is celebrated by the initiative as a great futuristic force. Well, why is that so? Well, they celebrate the natural environment as they call it a cutting-edge technology. So they say that, for instance, the horses that they use for agricultural work or other ecological systems that they work with, that for them, and here again I quote a member, the soil and the plants and the animals are otherwise more sophisticated, sensitive, and more beautiful beings than the aggregates of plates, electric cables that most machines are made of. And another example, again, are seeds. So they talk a lot about how they are dependent on seeds, on the ability of seeds to adapt if they want to be able to adapt as a community to different environmental and climatic circumstances in the future. So seeds in their diversity were valued by the community for their ability to interact and transform. And so therefore for them, the intelligence, the technology that is imagined by the collective is often relating back to what they find in their natural environment. So rather than looking for novel ideas, technologies, or development blueprints provided by urban centers of innovation, as they are called, the initiative values old knowledges and old practices that are in connection with nature, that draw from the diversity of species and ecologies in a sustainable and resilient manner. And then to get back to connectivity, the members of the collective also identify another kind of connectivity to be omnipresent in the countryside, which is a connection not outwards, but downwards, a connection to the territory. And the interdependence of everything and everyone, they say, for them seems to be much more obvious in their rural place. So in one of the interviews I had with one of the members, they described that in the countryside, people live in a different way, in a sense in which they meet more often, in which they cannot hide from each other. The direct opposite of life in big cities, where people often do not know each other anymore and merely pass through. And for the members of the initiative, these characteristics of the countryside make the countryside particularly suited to develop much needed practices and values of solidarity, of community and collaboration. And this, again, also includes solidarity and collaboration, care and respect between humans and animals, humans and plants and their ecologies. Because, as the members of the initiative say, they feel that since being in the countryside, they are much more exposed to the actual dependence on nature, the actual interconnection with nature. And they observe it in cities, when they particularly often speak about Paris. And in that case, in Paris, humans are mostly unaware of the ways in which they depend on their environment for survival. Life supporting activities such as the production of food or the cleaning of water, the production of energy are hidden from them. And in the countryside, they can, if they want, reconnect to this knowledge, become aware. And this is also what I want to end on. Is of course extremely important to note, the countryside does only offer those things in the case of the Ferme de la Motte in France, the French countryside, because they choose to see them, because they choose to engage with them. So there are many people who live in Western European countrysides nowadays who live in the countryside as if it was a city. So it villages without agricultural production, with jobs in the city, everything provided to them without having to think where it comes from. And similarly, conventional capitalist large-scale agriculture is, in its strive for technological mastery of soil and plants and the impact of weather, rather a trial for the absolute independence of humans from some disconnected idea of nature. So the important characteristic of the Ferme de la Motte is that its members have chosen to re-engage with the futuristic potential of the countryside. They have